Come on in, welcome to Idled Out, where we talk all things Survivor. My name is Luke, and today we're looking at the wild, dangerous history of Survivor's medical evacuations. From the first medical evacuation in the show's second season, through to the present. Survivor, of course, errs on the side of caution when it comes to evacuating players for medical reasons, but these injuries or illnesses are often quite alarming, from horrifying burns to stomach-churning infections, to a heat stroke in the show's 32nd season that literally almost killed a contestant. So today I thought it'd be interesting to go through every Survivor Medevac in order from Season 2 to Season 42, from the extremely frightening to the whittle bit of tummy pain. Just take some Pepto-Bismol, buddy. I'll explain what happened and how much this evacuation changed the course of the game, all over clips of brutal injuries. Sound fun? All that said, let's dig in to every Survivor Medevac ever. The first medical evacuation came 17 days into Survivor's second season, Survivor Australia. Self-appointed Kucha tribe leader Mike Skupin was tending to the fire when he inhaled smoke and briefly passed out, falling into the fire hands first. The camera crew only caught the aftermath of this as he ran into the river in a desperate attempt to curb his pain. Such a grisly injury on one of the main players of the season, captured in disturbing close-ups in the midst of Survivor's heyday, made national news, and quelled a lot of the comments that Survivor was scripted or otherwise fake. I mean, there's method acting, but no one's this dedicated to a role. Maybe Christian Bale. Unfortunately, I've got to say that Mike was extremely robbed here. Kucha was the stronger tribe, and Mike was its bizarro, boar-killing, Lord of the Flies-esque leader. If he doesn't fall into the fire, Kucha probably wins immunity and enters the merge with numbers, picks off Ogakor easily, and Mike Skupin makes the final 6, if not further. I'm sorry to say, but it's entirely possible that Skupin makes the final 3 with Elizabeth and Roger. Now, knowing what we know about Skupin now, it's clear the fire didn't go far enough, but I'm trying to be objective here. We didn't get another medical evacuation on Survivor until Season 12, when Bruce Kanegai was evacuated on day 25 thanks to stomach pains. Bruce had been constipated for days, and by the 4th night, he literally cannot take it anymore. Now, I don't like laughing at the pain of others, except here. A bad situation is only made worse by who he's stuck at camp with. Aris, Danielle, and Sari are off on an overnight spa reward, and Terry's been sent to Exile Island, leaving Bruce all alone on the beach with the cream of the crazy. Bruce desperately requests that a doctor come examine him, but Kourtney instead offers the healing power of song. When the medical team assesses Bruce and realizes he needs to be evacuated for further examination, they ask for Shane's help carrying Bruce out on the stretcher, and he's naked for some reason? That's weird. You had pants on when the doctors got here. Bruce set the precedent that evacuations who made it far enough can sit on the jury if they're well enough. And thankfully, Bruce fully recovered and is presumably still pooping to this very day. Bruce probably would have been seeing that jury bench soon anyway, though. He was on the outs of Kasaya and would have been an easy pickoff for the majority, assuming another Terry immunity win. And you know what? Things probably wouldn't have even been that different. Kourtney still probably would have sang to him when he's getting voted out, and Shane still probably would have been naked. We get a pair of evacuations in Survivor Micronesia 4 seasons later. The first evacuation was Jonathan Penner on day 15. Penner's leg was skewered by a piece of wood during an entertaining but very poorly thought out cat and mouse reward challenge that injured almost everyone who participated to some degree. Like every horrible thing that can happen to you during a challenge happens to someone right here. Fat lips, busted knees, being Chet. A few days pass and Penner's leg is only getting worse. So much so that Jeff insists he see medical. When they get there, the medical team takes one look at this knee and pulls him from the game to prevent the further spread of this infection, which they say could be fatal if left untreated. Penner gets a hero's exit, probably one of the most heroic exits ever, injury or not. Penner spent 3 weeks in the hospital for this injury, but would he have made it another 3 weeks in the game? Probably not. His post-swap tribe, Irai, lost only 1 challenge out of the 7 in the post-swap stage of the game, so I'm guessing he makes the merge. But that's about as far as I see him going. He was a major target in the game without many friends, so I think it's likely he goes out as the merge boot or shortly thereafter. Can you imagine Jason trying to convince Eliza and Penner that this stick is an idol? We were truly robbed. The other medical evacuation in Micronesia was James Clement. James's evacuation is not as exciting. He was evacuated for a cut on his finger. You know, if anyone was going to sustain a finger injury this season, I would have thought it would be her. At some point towards the end of the game, James cuts his finger, he thinks while clamming. James was examined after the final 8 tribal council, since his finger was swelling to extreme proportions. The doctors fear that if it gets infected, it could spread to his joints, so they give him until morning to see if it gets better, which it does not, giving us our latest evacuation yet on day 31. This didn't really change much, to be honest. James was next to go anyway, and he can't win an immunity challenge to save his life, so he probably still goes out in this exact spot. The only difference in that reality, he's not bringing his IV bag to the jury. Or maybe he is. He's a big boy. He needs those fluids. The next evacuation came 2 seasons later in Season 18, Survivor Tocantins. This is probably our most forgettable evacuation ever, as Joe Dowdle gets pulled from the game for a leg injury that could get infected, and yeah, it's been done. This is just a worse version of Penner's injury. It's like the monkeys of Survivor injuries. Joe's infected leg festers for a few days, but he's officially evacuated on day 20, shortly after the merge. Normally, when a medevac happens after an immunity challenge, it's the climax of the episode. It's inherently dramatic, so it makes sense narratively to end the episode with that. But Joe is such a minor character this season that we spend most of the time at the end of the episode that would normally be dedicated to the medevac, instead setting up a Brendan blindside the next episode. Joe's evacuation might have rearranged the deck chairs on the Timbira Titanic, but I don't think it dramatically changed the season. Brendan probably goes as the merge boot, and with the Joe and Aaron connection from Exile, it's possible she joins the Jalapao 4 now. Maybe they get a tighter grip on the game slightly earlier. The only difference would be that Joe gets to ask a boring, adoring jury question to JT instead of Brendan. The very next season, Survivor Samoa, we get 2 medical evacuations. After an intense physical challenge on day 5, Mike Borassi suffers labored breathing and collapses. Medical takes one look at him and pulls him from the game. What do you want me to say? If it didn't happen now, it would have happened later. In fact, he had already previously been pulled from a cast. He was literally on Survivor Tocantins, but pulled at the last minute for health reasons. There is literal precedent for this. And to be honest, this elimination didn't change much. I'm gonna wager that Foa mercy votes him out at the next tribal council, and if they don't, he's probably pulled at the next immunity challenge anyway, which is the one that caused his collapse in the first place, but now in water. 10 days later, Russell Swan is also pulled from Survivor Samoa. Russ blacks out from dehydration during a table maze challenge on day 15, in what is easily the scariest evacuation since Mike Skupin fell in the fire. Russell collapses on the maze face first, and at Tribal Council later, Jeff calls this the scariest moment he's ever had on the show. And, Yeah, Jeff cancels the challenge and dismisses the tribes back to their camps, but he and Medical stay with Russell. When they simply try to sit Russell up, he passes out again, and you can see Jeff's career flash before his very eyes as Russell's face goes completely blank. Well, this shit's getting canceled. Back to rock and roll Jeopardy for me. Thankfully, Russell is stabilized, and quite obviously, he's getting pulled from the game. This evacuation is probably one of the most game-changing ever. Russell's evacuation canceled a dual tribal in which both tribes were going to vote someone out. On Galoo, that's probably Shambo, and a Shambo-less Galoo, united under Russell's leadership, might have been better suited to resist fracture from Foa. It's really impossible to say what happens because there are so many different factors that could change things dramatically, but at the very least, Foa has a harder path to the end. As for who wins, we'll just go with the most entertaining option. Dave Ball wins. 2 more medical evacuations happen in Survivor One World a few years later. Kourtney Moon becomes the first and so far only woman to be medically evacuated from Survivor when she failed to tuck her arms in when falling on a net and injuring her wrist during the first immunity challenge. This was probably for the best. While it's sad she was removed from the game on day 3 before she could ever cast a vote, the doctors later discovered a grapefruit-sized tumor in her abdomen during a wellness check. As far as I know, Kourtney is healthy now, so this is the only time a Survivor injury was probably life-saving. As for Kourtney's placement, she's not the first boot in One World, that's probably now Nina, but she was outside the main alliance, which stuck together the entire game. So if Solani keeps losing, either she or Christina are probably next. I don't know, doesn't really change much in the grand scheme of things. Kim still cakewalks to the end, except possibly with Kourtney as the Alliance's +1 instead of Christina, especially if our next Medevac still happens. The other medical evacuation this season was Colton Cumbie on day 16. On day 16, Colton began feeling lightheaded and passed out in the jungle. He must have seen a minority or something. The medical team rushes to Colton's side and tentatively diagnoses him with acute appendicitis. This ultimately turned out not to be true. Colton had a bad bacterial infection, but regardless, he's pulled from the game. Somewhat amusingly, Jeff isn't even sure that Colton's really even in pain. He called this a quit in Blood vs. Water. Jeff's never been a Colton fan, and you can see the skepticism in his face right here. This is undoubtedly the most frustrating Medevac in history for me. Colton was cruel and petty, and not in an entertaining way. We, the audience, deserved to see him get voted out. We needed to see him lose at this game, which, to be fair to him, would have come a lot later than pre-merge. Survivor's own little King Joffrey would have lost the Game of Thrones to Kim eventually, but he had a lot of fight left in him. I'm not sure if he reaches the merge and tries to lead the men, or if he defects and joins Kim's alliance, probably the latter. But either way, Colton was unfortunately probably going far in this game, and he was the only real threat to Kim's domination. The most frustrating part, Colton came back 3 seasons later and then quit, ensuring that he's one of only a handful of players who've played multiple times and never been voted out. Really makes your blood boil, doesn't it? 2 seasons later, we get a pair of evacuations in Survivor Karamoan, both of which you probably forgot about? I'll give you a second. Which fan favorite character was evacuated pre-merge? If you answered Shamar Thomas, you're wrong. I said fan favorite. Shamar was evacuated on day 10 for a grain of sand in his eye, which he rubbed, only exacerbating the problem. Maybe? According to Shamar in his exit press, he was evacuated for a finger injury, and the eye injury was only secondary. You can see this in the episode if you're watching for it. His hand is quite clearly swollen and quite clearly in pain. Now, I'm not saying this is definitely the case. He could have been pulled for both injuries, and they just went with one in the edit because it's easier. And this isn't just a case of them trying to edit an unlikable character as getting taken out by a boo-boo, because the edit backs up the seriousness of Shamar's eye injury. I don't know, this one's pretty weird to me. As for how this affected the game, would Shamar have gone next on Goda? I'm not sure. He was checked out of the game and no one liked him. I could totally see the Goda majority just biting the bullet and getting rid of him even though he's in their alliance. But it is possible that they just stick with him and vote out Eddie instead. Back in reality though, all Shamar's medevac did was ensure that one of the only fans with any game sense at all, Laura, was voted out pre-swap later that day as a challenge liability, ensuring the Goda tribe's strategic downfall. More so. Another oft-forgotten evacuation is the latest evacuation ever later this season, when fan-turned-favorite Erik Reichenbach collapsed on day 36 and is pulled from the game at Final 5 for low blood pressure. This is literally how the season finale opens. Erik is unceremoniously carted away. What is it about the evacuations this season and being super bizarre? This is edited weirdly and they kinda rush through it, but there's a lot more to the story that Erik shared on a video on his YouTube channel. Erik received a cut on his leg in the post-swap portion of the game, which eventually got infected. As the game was winding down, Medical was keeping an eye on the leg, but they didn't want to pull him from the game if they didn't have to, especially since he was so close to the end. They gave Erik penicillin, which unbeknownst to him, he was allergic to. That, combined with the malnutrition and dehydration he was already going through during the game, gave him an extremely adverse reaction, which is what we saw in the episode. I don't think Erik's evacuation really changed much, however. Erik and Eddie were the next two on the chopping block for Cochran, Dawn, and Sherry, so Erik only makes the final three if he wins both immunities, which, to be fair, is possible. Still, he's probably out in this spot regardless, but we were 2 challenge wins away from the guy who gave individual immunity to Natalie winning this game. You should have given that penicillin to Natalie instead. Finally, we're at the season you've all been waiting for, Season 32, Survivor Ko-Rong. If the numbers are anything to go by, this is Survivor's most dangerous season ever. 3 collapsing players, 2 pus-filled infections, and a bug in Jenny's ear. There were other factors, but you can thank the brutal conditions here in Cambodia across 31 and 32 as a big factor in why Survivor decided to set up permanent shop in Fiji. On day 9, we get our first evacuation when Caleb Reynolds beast modes a little too hard during a reward challenge and collapses from heat stroke. This is the most horrifying evacuation in the show's history, bar none. The triple degree heat, combined with the already physically taxing reward challenge running over an hour, caused Caleb, as well as Sydney and Debbie, all to collapse. The worst part, other than Caleb nearly dying, this was a reward for Salt and Pepper. The way he's digging, you'd think Amber's buried down there. For the first time in the show's history, they drop all pretense of the fourth wall separation, as the camera crew rushes to capture Caleb's collapse on tape, giving us plenty of shots of the production crew at the challenge. The emergency and its aftermath take up nearly half the episode, and we even yada yada Alicia's boot later to make room for more Caleb. It's extremely frightening, and Caleb even had to be sent back to the United States for medical care. As for how Caleb would have fared on the season, it's tough to say since the swap came right after this, and who knows how it shakes out with him from there. I do think Caleb was strategically out of his depth on this season, and I could see him being the swap screw the very next round, a la Anna. Although, clearly, Survivor believed in him more than I do. The episode even ends with a tribute to Caleb, all but promising us that he'll get a second shot, which, as we all know, he made the most of. 10 days later, on day 19, Neal Gottlieb was evacuated for several staph infections, particularly old Mount St. Neal here. There are obviously other injuries on this show that were more immediately life-threatening, but this is probably the most stomach-churning for me. Neal's leaky knee and the, dead skin on the infection on his back are disgusting, and I apologize for showing them to you. And that's not even the half of it. Not only do we get to see Neal's infections this episode, but half the cast gets inspected, but only Neal's have exploded everywhere and are worthy of removal. Neal's knee really changed Survivor history. If he stays, Aubrey is almost certainly the merge boot, as the majority splits votes on them, and Neal probably plays his idol. Who knows if Aubrey even plays again in that case? As for Neal, there are just too many moving parts after that to predict where he would land in the game. I could see him going next, or I could see the Braun and Beauty alliance fracturing and him making a deep run. Still, as we're officially at the jury stage of the game, and with precedent set by Bruce and James before him, Neal does get the distinction of serving on the jury, a right which no one can take away from him. Finally, our final evacuation of Korong came on day 34 when Joe Del Campo ate too much beef on a reward and got constipated, necessitating a late-game evacuation, if you catch my drift. This isn't the most exciting evacuation in Survivor history, but it is one that changed the trajectory and very possibly the winner of the season. Joe eats one less beef wrap on that reward. Aubrey wins the game, potentially. It all depends on how the challenges were originally set up, but if the Final 4 reward challenge was originally the Final 5 immunity before Joe's evacuation, as many believe it was, then Aubrey wins that, as we saw, and Michelle is likely the boot at Final 5. If Aubrey and Sydney are forced into a fire-making tie the next round, well, we also already saw how that played out. Either way, one of the two of Aubrey and Sydney goes to the end with Joe and Ty, and unless a coalition of bitter Bettys decide to pin all their votes on Ty, Sydney, or more likely Aubrey, is our winner. It's almost like Joe's evacuation was some sort of weird Final Destination-esque universe course correction after Aubrey was spared elimination by Neal's evacuation weeks earlier. Live by the Medevac, die by the Medevac. We didn't get another medical evacuation for 5 seasons until season 37, when Pat Cusack was evacuated on day 3 of Survivor David vs. Goliath. On the boat ride back to camp following the first immunity challenge, extremely choppy ocean water causes Pat to bounce up and down in his seat and land weirdly, causing a back injury necessitating a medical pull. This wasn't caught on camera. The players aren't filmed when they're being transported to and from challenges. So the episode fades to commercial after the immunity challenge, then fades back in with the medical team bringing Pat back to the beach on a stretcher. Carl must have taken a similar hit. When the David tribe is shown coming back to the beach, Carl is being assisted by members of production. Pat was getting pulled from this game the second he said his back was in pain. The doctors suspect that Pat fractured something, so off he goes. Forget a meal, Jeff makes a buffet out of Pat's evacuation, arguing that if any tribe in the history of Survivor was going to have a medical evacuation on day 3, of course it would be the David tribe, a tribe literally cast as underdogs. We probably missed out on a pretty exciting tribal council because of this, too. The first boot was going to be Pat or Nick, and while I do think the votes ultimately would have landed on Pat, the whole season obviously changes if Nick leaves first. For one, they'd have to bring in his creepy vampire arc from his second season way earlier. Finally, our most recent medical evacuation was Jackson Fox in Survivor 42. This is a bit of an odd note to end on. Jackson was evacuated on day 3 after Lindsay noticed he was dehydrated and dizzy. Speaking to Jackson privately, Jeff confronts him about his previously undisclosed lithium use, of which he was weaning himself off of, but nevertheless failed to tell production about until a day before starting the game. Lithium withdrawal is no joke, so Jackson is medically disqualified from the show the second he started showing symptoms. It's easy to envision Jeff in seasons past ripping a player a new one for failing to disclose something like this until a day before the game started. After all, Jackson ends up being a wasted spot on an otherwise incredible cast, and he could have been saved for a future season while someone else took his spot on 42. I mean, imagine being this season's alternate. But this is the era of a softer, kinder Probst, so Jackson gets the kid gloves. If Jackson stays, the season is changed too much to even speculate, but what we do know is that Taku wins the first immunity challenge, and Vati would have to join Ika in voting someone out in episode 1. We also know that if Taku loses 2 immunity challenges, Jackson is probably an early boot alongside Mariah. All I know is, if Vati has to vote someone out on day 3, Lydia probably goes home, and Jenny doesn't get screwed out of the game on day freaking 7. Thanks, Jackson. Got nothing else for ya. Before you evacuate this video, like and subscribe, and I'll get you more Survivor content just like this. Until next time, don't get idled out.